And that was considered one of the major victories of the revolution, to have the ejido system. So the fact that the ejido system was thrown out meant that all these farmers who were going bankrupt could lose their land. And it was being seized up by banks and creditors who were then reselling it to huge agribusiness. And at the same time, you had Mexican lenders, the interest rates were like 30% to 40%, whereas under NAFTA, you had what was the name of it, U.S. Commodity Credit Corporation was giving loans to to Mexican corporations, many of whom were subsidiaries of U.S. agribusiness food processors, to get loans to buy corn, other crops from the U.S. at 7% over 3 years. So there was huge incentives to undermine Mexican agriculture, to the extent that millions of people who were either involved in agriculture or had jobs related to agriculture lost their work. And of course, that made for enormous migration to the cities and to areas where you had these new assembly plants going on, of people who were desperate for any jobs. And in fact, immigration of people crossing the border into the United States doubled between 1993, before NAFTA, and 2000. All these people coming to the cities. Now, I was in Baja California, so you had all these new assembly plants going up, workers coming to them, but there was no infrastructure built. And the pay that people were getting at $4 a day, there's often an idea among people when they would come, I would do tours with Congress people and other people would come to Mexico to see what was going on, and people would have the idea, well, the living expenses must be so much lower in Mexico, so that's how people could get by. You think, $4 a day, how could anyone live on that? The reality was the living expenses were much lower because nobody could afford to pay rent in an apartment or a house, so people who were coming from the rural areas were building their own houses out of the cardboard boxes from appliances that the corporations were throwing out. And they were having to build them in the land that nobody else would live on, which was generally the canyons and land nobody else wanted to build on outside of the plants. And so you had just enormous, enormous tracts of squatters who worked in these plants because they couldn't live anywhere else. About a year after NAFTA was passed, you know, they say it never rains in Southern California. It doesn't rain often in Baja California either. But once every like 7 years, there'll be rain. And if you ever had a house plant and didn't water it for a long time, you know that when it gets really dry, the water just kind of runs off. It doesn't go into the soil. You had all these people living in these canyons and enormous floods. I think it rained for like 10 days straight, nonstop. And so many people were either drowned or lost everything who lived in the canyons about a year after NAFTA passed. The other thing that came with NAFTA, previous to NAFTA, there was repression against organizing. You had a state-controlled union system. In fact, one of the reasons that Mexico never had the problems that that countries in Central America had in terms of A-field, I'm not going to get into I could talk a long time about this, but A-field was set up as a cover for the CIA to go into countries to keep organizing out that was considered to be dangerous to U.S. interest, and was very instrumental in Central America during the 80s. in undermining union organizing efforts in Nicaragua and other countries. They would establish agreements, funding came through the AID, and under the guise of supporting democratic unions, they would throw enormous amount of money into unions being set up that would have no strike clauses and not do anything to really represent workers. And unions that actually were trying to represent workers would be undermined in various ways. In Mexico, there was never any of that A-field infiltration because the unions were controlled by the government. However, with the coming of NAFTA, there was a feeling on the part of the U.S. that there needed to be additional protections here. The other thing that happened around January 1st, 1994, in fact 2 weeks before, was the first election for an independent union in a maquiladora, which I was personally involved in helping to support and getting independent observers down there from unions and organizations throughout California. In Baja California, it was even worse than other areas of Mexico in terms of union control. Because in other areas of Mexico, you had a lot of industry before, so the government-controlled unions really existed, even though they were repressive. In Baja, there hadn't been a lot of industry, so what was set up from the start was simply protection contracts. Workers didn't ever see a union, didn't know there was a union, and the government union would sign a protection contract with the company. And companies were told when they set up plants there, listen, you don't have to ever worry about labor unrest because if ever there's a problem, we'll have the union come out. It was a protection contract. Workers in a company named Plásticos Baja Cal had begun organizing. It was a company owned by Carlyle Corporation in Boston, Massachusetts. And they wanted to form a union. And they were told, you can't form a union here. There's already a union here. It has a contract signed with the company. So the workers sort of, we never saw a union. What's going on? The government said, well, you have to have an election. Oh, my time is up. Okay, I'll be quick. The election was held in front of people from the government, people from the company, and workers had to vote out loud after having been told inside the plant that if they voted for the independent union, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. So you can imagine how fair this election was. I can't go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say, the people who were the main workers involved in organizing, one of them, a woman named Antonia, the day after the election, she had a son, her only child was 8 years old, disappeared, and he was never seen again. That was 2 weeks before NAFTA's passage. The U.S. was very concerned about organizing, starting to build up along the border in Mexico, so they decided they had to send in actions similar to what was going on with A-field. I can't go into details about that because of time limitations here, but we were able to expose what they were doing, and they weren't able to carry out their initial plans. But they have managed to, after NAFTA passed, we saw many, many strange things going on. A worker rights attorney in Juarez suddenly closed his office and got a job being in charge of prisons in the state. Mm-hmm. Lots of money being thrown around in different directions and organizations closing down. Or people disappearing. But I'll leave it at that. NAFTA and free trade is not free, but ends up with tremendous, tremendous repression against worker rights, environmental rights, rights to health and safety, against democracy. Thank you.